Hello. Today I will be making a review and I will show you the specifications, or I will mention specifications for this Toshiba vintage laptop. It's a T2130CS, a model that has been released around 1995, and it has a 486 DX4 processor at 75 MHz. I will be showing you the case first, the features next, and I will go along with some benchmarks and show it running DOS and Windows software. Alright, so this laptop has some very nice features. One of them, and the most important from my point of view, at least taking into account peripherals and adapters, is the fact that it can be directly plugged into the mains. I think this is very important because many vintage laptops can be quite problematic because you cannot find the proper power adapter for them. Although this is not a surefire way of achieving a working laptop, or at least having a working configuration, it is somewhat easier to handle, and of course it makes you avoid any sort of unpleasant storing issues if you have multiple adapters and multiple laptops. On the other side, of course, if something goes wrong, you have to probably find a replacement power supply, and this means that the issue is much more complex. Alright, let me start by showing you the left side of the laptop. Over here you have a cover that actually makes an easy access to the internal parts. In this case I have used a compact flash card in an adapter in order to replace the internal IDE drive, but I will get back to it immediately. These palmets can be slid and lift, so you have access to the internal parts, which is very nice. You don't have to take apart the whole laptop. This was an issue especially for older models. You have two Pcmcia slots that you can see over here. They can be accessed either individually or together. Of course, this is for adapters that have only a specific part that should be made available. So it's a neat feature, but it's not necessarily a system that can withstand shocks very well. The power on off switch, the cancel to unlock. Moving further, the input adapter. I think this one is an universal input voltage adapter, so it should be able to work from 100 volts up to 240 volts, so probably anywhere in the world it should be able to work. The printer port, the parallel printer port, the Vga output. I have to say that there were some laptops that did not have a Vga output, and especially from Toshiba. I think this is the case for some Portage laptops. I think the first Portage laptop that was very compact had only a docking port like this one, but did not have a Vga output. Next, you have a serial port output and the PS2 port. Moving further, the floppy drive, and here you have my first major gripe with this laptop, or my first major disappointment with this laptop. It was typical for Toshiba to use floppy drives that had the internal mechanism driven, the platter actually, rotated using a belt drive transmission system. And I think this system was very bad because it meant that the floppy drive is unusable if the belt, as time goes on, gets damaged, and this is quite obviously what happens. All right, moving further, you have the status indicators and I think the reset switch. That is a reset switch. The indicator for the battery and the one for the power adapter. And as mentioned, you have these locking systems, and you can lift the palm rest. I will show you right now the rest. The keyboard is your typical Toshiba keyboard. I think that the same model has been used for around 3 years. I may be wrong, but could be more. Toshiba used the same keyboard layout, the same keyboard system. I'm not entirely sure if the ribbon that connects the keyboard is the same. Could be, which was a surprise. Many laptops had different keyboards, different layouts as they went down the production line. Alright, as said, you can lift the palm rest and you have access to the battery, which I'm pretty sure was the same for many Toshiba models for around 3 years, which is a great time span in the IT industry. And you have the IDE standard adapter. I have to say that this laptop has some issues with higher capacity drives, which means that you have to find quite with a lot of efforts some sort of adapters or drives that can be reliably operating with the BIOS this laptop has. This is quite typical of laptops of this vintage. You don't have to be surprised, and especially the capacity, you have to think that typically such a laptop would be supplied with a 300 megabyte or 500 megabytes. Having 2000 megabytes or 2 gigabyte compact flash cards would be very large. Of course, it's an issue of auto detecting. You cannot do much because there are no options to specify your own disk drive geometry, but that's it. All right, let me plug the system in. What I should have said. There is also a tracking system, a cursor tracking system. It's the well-known Toshiba Acupoint. This was similar to IBM's implementation of the track point. It's quite nice. It's much easier to handle and work, since you don't have to clean it as on a trackball. On the other side, it has some disadvantages. I don't know exactly how reliable it is. I have seen track points broken. I don't know how they were operated, but this is how things happen. Of course, I'm talking about laptops of the same vintage, so the first Pentium CPU laptops range, Toshiba satellites, around I think 1995, 1996. I'm not entirely sure what actually happens. I have also seen track points broken, so IBM clearly is not indestructible in this respect. Alright, let me plug it in. And of course you have the status indicator over here, and I should be showing you. This one shows that the laptop is plugged in, and I think it's lit with yellow or orange if the laptop is in a low power mode. The hard disk drive activity indicator could be also the floppy drive indicator. This was quite common back then. Caps lock, scroll lock, and num lock. And over here you have the speaker. I have to say that this laptop doesn't have any integrated sound card, so you have only the integrated PCB port. Alright, let's plug it in. And started. The screen. I have to say something about the screen, unfortunately, because the laptop does not feature an active matrix TFT screen. It's the passive matrix one, which means that the contrast is going to be very low and it's going to look very bad, but you cannot do much about that. It's a color one, but as I said, the contrast and brightness is going to be very low. I hope the camera will catch it as well as it can. Of course, the backlight, the fluorescent backlight, is also quite used. So it's not going, it's slightly used actually. So it's not going to have the highest brightness it could be, but I think this is acceptable. The screen, however, wasn't much brighter even when new. This was the technology. With a contrast ratio of 20:1, you cannot do too much. To have a rough comparison, think about that modern laptops have a 1000:1 contrast ratio, and typical laptops of that time, if they had an active matrix screen, had a contrast ratio of 100:1. Let me see now if I can make a better focus. Yes, I think this is the limitation we will have to contend with. There is not much improvement that I can see. All right, what I have to say, since it's a passive matrix screen, you have a knob over here that you must adjust if the brightness of a specific scene is going to be higher or lower. So for instance, if you work in Windows and you are working in a document, perhaps you can turn the contrast higher. If you are working in DOS and you have I don't know, you are running not on Commander, or if you're using anything else that has obviously darker colors, you will have to reduce the contrast because it's going to be less visible. All right, so let me start DOS shell program. Actually, not DOS shell, is not on Commander. Well, as you can see, it's quite bright. I will see if I can make some adjustments so that it looks slightly better. All right, to me this looks better, but of course focus again has been affected. This is as good as it gets. You have to bear with me, it's a passive matrix screen, you cannot have high expectations. You can see all these lines that are typical of passive matrix screens. Those are artifacts of the technology that has been used. Of course, even TFT screens have some artifacts, but they are much lower. The most important gripe, the most important disadvantage and pleasant occurrence you have with these screens is that besides their very low contrast, they are horrible for games. Alright, let me show you some benchmarks so that we can have a better understanding of the laptop's configuration. Alright, I will be showing you Vga Bench because this is quite popular. It's a very good benchmark. It's typically used with laptops of this era and shows quite well the laptop's capabilities. Not expecting a very high value, not a very low either. I think it's going to be decent, yes, roughly 40, not bad. Something along this value. I was expecting 40 or 50 frames per second, which is fine. For a 320 by 200 screen, that's okay. Alright, the screen. Yes, I should have mentioned the screen. The screen is an 11.3 inches one with a resolution of 640 by 480. So this one should be perfect for playing those games. Of course, some scaling is going to occur probably, and we will see if this is the case. But ultimately, this is what you can expect. I will show you Chris benchmark because it's a good benchmarking program. Of course, it runs in 640 by 480. It's the Pcp benchmark. This one is 320 by 200. As you can see, there are some artifacts when the object moves, something like a ghosting. color ghosting. This is to be expected, you cannot do much. Actually, this is one of the reasons for which these screens are quite hated. You cannot do anything about that. This was typical. Of course, for office applications, it's somewhat bearable. And you have to think that typically an active LCD, an active matrix LCD screen would be around $500 more, or up to almost $100 or $1,000 when those laptops were being sold. So it was a massive difference. You could have a color screen, and you have to understand that previously 486 laptops had color screens but also monochrome screens. So the moment the technology switched to color screens only being specified, it was still an improvement, although not high improvement. Monochrome screens had even lower performance figures. I think that 80:1 contrast ratio to 20 or 25:1 compared with the color one. So not much improvement, but anyway. Alright, let me show you a Doom benchmark, because this is also very interesting. I don't know if I will show you the entire demo, although it runs perfectly. It's a 486 ultimately, and since it runs at 75 MHz, it's more than enough for such a game. Of course, it doesn't run as fast as on Pentium ones. You cannot have quite a good grasp of the screen's brightness or the potential of the laptop, mainly due to the fact that the screen is updating so slowly. So even if the frame rate is not bad, the overall feel of the game is quite unpleasant. But you can play Doom, although I would not recommend it. I think it's going to be quite exhausting, quite annoying. I can also adjust slightly the contrast, and if I place it just right, probably it's going to be slightly better. But as you can see, all these artifacts when the image moves makes it quite annoying. You cannot do much about that, or actually you cannot do anything else but plugging an external screen and seeing it as such. Alright, I don't think it matters if I will show you anything else, and I'm going to end it. The Pcp Benchmark is the one I previously mentioned. It's running in 640 by 480. Of course, it's quite a high resolution. In here, you're not having any sort of doubt that the frame rate is not very high, and this is true. Actually, playing in 640 by 480 or 640 by 400, as it shows over here, it's quite demanding, 5.6 frames per second. This goes on to show that it's likely Quake will not run that well on the system. Actually, Quake was designed with a Pentium laptop processor, so I'm not having any sort of expectations of it running too fast. Alright, let me start. Of course, as I said, 40 megabytes of data. Yes, the laptop's configuration is with 16 megabytes of RAM, so this is going to be ample enough in order to run the game. Alright. As you can see, it's not overly fast. Again, I can slightly make an attempt at increasing the brightness, but of course, as you can see, there is no great choice over here. I can also change the brightness in the game, but I'm not entirely sure if this is going to be a real solution. Sorry, this was not the setting. This is. I think roughly this is as good as it will get. It shows somewhat similar on the camera. Let me see if I can make any sort of improvement. No, Now, this is as good as it's going to get. All right, let me run the benchmark. As you can see, it's not very slow, not very fast either. I think it will get around 10 frames per second, I'm not entirely sure. This is a typical value you get with 486 processors. Ultimately, the video card is not very important in this case. You have to remember the fact that, or you have to know the fact that those applications do not use too much the video frame buffer, other than for calculations that are made on your CPU. Actually, the video chipset is just used in order to transfer the information from the system's RAM. So actually, the video chipset is much less involved than in modern 3D games. It's also software accelerated, which means the CPU makes all the necessary calculations for lighting and texturing. So ultimately, what happens over here does not involve the video chipset too much. However, the video chipset can interfere by being overly slow or not handling well certain drawing routines. And in that case, probably the performance is going to be quite lower. If I remember correctly, you can have roughly an indication of performance, or the performance gap, when you think about your typical Western Digital branded Paradise video chipset. When it was used in laptops, it was slightly slower and had some issues with screen updates. There were some slight tearing effects, like, I don't know, dots that appeared on the screen due to compatibility, which you're not going to see with this video chipset. So ultimately, there are some cases when 8.2 frames per second, not bad. It's a very small difference from what I was expecting. I was expecting around 10 frames, so probably 9 was normal, 8 frames, it's just the same. Alright, so not a bad value. It can be probably playable, let's see. Although I previously mentioned that the screen is going to be the biggest disappointment. The frames per second rate is not that bad in person. Of course, when enemies are going to appear, I'm pretty sure that you will have a difficult time trying to shoot them, to kill them. Right. I think you saw enough in terms of the performance you may expect. Alright. Let me just slightly lower the brightness so that it looks better. Okay, I can probably make it somewhere in between, since we're also going to run Windows. Alright. Yes, I will show you a typical benchmark so that we can have a rough estimation of the system speed. I will show you NSSI, which is a good application for this purpose. Let me see. Alright, let's reboot the system. I also have to say one more thing regarding the configuration. I think that this laptop fully supports the ATX standard, because you can type a specific command, or you can shut down the Windows completely, the Windows 95 installation completely, without leaving it running. So I think it's quite well. It's a quite well designed system in this respect. Alright, let me show you the typical benchmark. We are going to see also the arithmetic logical unit and the floating point unit performance. I'm not expecting anything out of ordinary. Alright, as you can see, it's over the performance of DX266. It's probably near to what a typical 75 megahertz processor would reach in terms of performance. It's quite stable, so you can have a very predictable performance. All right, let's move on. The next test is going to be this one pertaining to the floating point unit. Again, your typical values. So I think that this laptop handles very well the CPU performance figures. However, I want to show to you something else, because this laptop, just like most of this vintage, have a very interesting feature, and that is a power saving feature that also downclocks the processor. This has been available for many laptops. However, there are situations where such a laptop is not going to have major problems when running in certain issues. So the performance is going to be the typical one. You can reduce it by pressing function and F2, and if you press it, I think this, yeah, it should get lower. Let's see, did it get any lower? No, it didn't. Alright, I'm not entirely sure what is the reason behind it not responding to this setting. Probably something in BIOS. We will investigate that probably. But anyway, let's move on. The configuration is the typical one you would expect. As I said, the installed hard drive had a capacity of 540 megabytes. The compact flash being used over here is 2 gigabyte one, so it's quite large. All right, as mentioned, there isn't any integrated sound card. All right, I think this is the typical configuration you may expect. Let me see if I can remember how you can start the laptop. I don't remember if you have to press escape or not while starting in order to invoke the BIOS. Let's see. Okay, great. So you have your typical options over here. You can change the display mode, I think. I'm not entirely sure if it's yeah, you can change it from color to monochrome. There are many reasons why you would do that. You can change the amount of colors that the LCD display shows. Actually, I don't think that the number of colors being presented over here is the real value. I think that there is some interpolation on the panel, because I'm pretty sure that the panel is not able to show that many individual colors. I think that there is some sort of interpolation that happens. You can change text mode stretch, and I'm pretty sure if I will disable the text mode stretch, the screen is going to have less height in most applications. Alright, no, I don't want to exit, sorry. Battery save mode, CPU sleep, display auto off, this drive auto off. It's important, especially if you don't have a working internal CMOS battery, or if it's not operating as it should. You have to remember each and every time you start the system to change the setting from standard to enhanced IDE. Otherwise your hard drive is probably not going to be properly detected. Alright, CPU cache, processing speed, yes. Let me see, power up mode, boot. I remember there was a setting, battery save mode. No, LCD brightness, processing speed, probably you can change it from here. And right now, if I'm going to press end, and save. You also noticed that this light changed from green to orange, which means that the power saving mode is active. You already noticed that the memory test is much slower and probably the system speed is lowered too. I don't remember exactly how the power saving feature should be changed in the BIOS in order to make it operate with the typical speed and then the lower speed, but I'm pretty sure you can achieve that. However, I'm just going to show how low the performance is going to be when the CPU is put into the lower clock rate. Alright, 47 megahertz. This was quite typical. Even more modern laptops, the first and the second generation Pentium 1s, even Pentium 2s had the same feature. You could have half the clock speed, and then you could probably run CPU sensitive programs, or you could reduce the amount of power that is going to be required to power the system. So you could make your battery last longer or your system to run cooler. But in this case, since you have 486 processors, the impact is not going to be that high. Let's see. Yes. Alright. And your typical performance when running the floating point unit test is going to be roughly at the same values. So not a bad feature, especially if you want to run all the software that is speed sensitive. Alright, let me enter the BIOS again. I don't think I started the system properly. Oh, yes, I did it just as required. Alright, let's change the processing speed from low to high. And let's save the settings. Actually, this speed setting is quite important, especially when you want to have a rough understanding of how a typical system would behave with that particular processor. In this case, at 37 MHz, speed is roughly at the same level of the first generation 486 processors. So you can have a good understanding of how much technology and performance evolved. Alright, we will also see Windows 95, but first let's see Windows 3.1. Well, actually you can have a long debate if it's Windows 3.1, it's Windows 3.11. Ultimately, I think that the framework is from the Windows 3. It's Windows 3.11 or Windows for Workgroups, but actually it's running more like a Windows 3.1 system because you don't have 32-bit disk access or 32-bit file access. These are compromises you need to make since you cannot have Windows 95 and these older Windows versions running on the same system without compromising on this feature. Because if you load the drivers from Windows 3.1, Windows 95 is not going to start. If you run it with the drives required by Windows 95, the installable file system, you're not going to be able to use 32-bit file access and disk access in Windows 3.1, but the impact is going to be much lower, and especially if you use smart drive or use a compact flash disk, the impact is going to be much more reduced. Alright, let me show you the benchmarks. I have to say that it runs in 640 by 480 with 256 colors. Although you can potentially run it with high colors, 65,000 colors, because the chipset has, as far as I can tell, 1 megabyte video memory, so this is plenty. I advise against it. First of all, I don't think the panel could be run reliably with high color engines, and of course the performance impact is going to be quite high. I will run first of all this torque test that is very good, very reliable and shows very clearly the performance you can get from this video chipset. Especially the values for the transfers between the video memory have to be considered in this way. So they are quite predictable. Alright, 7 and 9. I think those values are roughly along the lines of how you can expect your typical video chipset to behave. I think they may be slightly lower than your typical Western Digital implementation, but I'm not confident it's that high of a difference. The major issue is having the same configuration with different video chipset, and this is quite hard. If you have a different video chipset or a different configuration, any sort of performance benchmark information you will get will be different. But I think it's roughly along the line. However, this video card has a very interesting feature, and I will show you that in action. Of course, you will not probably guess what I'm actually pointing at, but I will show you the result immediately. So this is the value I'm pointing at. I think it's almost 2 times the typical value you would get on any 486 laptop with a different video chipset. With your typical Western Digital Paradise, actually, the Paradise video chipset, you would get half this performance, around 20. This performance test is going to be very high, and I'm pretty sure these are not benchmarks that are in any way affected by driver optimizations as we see today. The spreadsheet test is also nice, but roughly offers the same values you will probably get with your typical Western Digital or Paradise video chipset. I can look upon just a moment if those values are roughly along the line. Yes, let's see the paint test. I will get back to the comment immediately. And the final test is going to be the word processing one. Alright, those are the values. So 7, 14, 21, 16. These are the values that are for a typical Western Digital chipset installation. So 41, 19, 27 compared with 16, 19 compared with 21, which is roughly similar, and 41 compared with just 13, so it was more than double. This is a very important difference, and the CAD performance, I think, is very high. And let me now show you why I mentioned this. You can see in the drivers that you have your typical set that features AutoCAD, Lotus, Windows, and WordPerfect. I'm pretty sure that all these files for AutoCAD, even if they are not used over here, I'm pretty sure they are not used over here, they're probably for the DOS version, show that probably the video chipset is optimized for these activities. Alright, let's exit the system, and then I will show you the Windows 95 installation running. But before that, let me show you how AutoCAD is going to work with a specific file, and I will load the typical file I always do in such circumstances. I don't think that comment was taken. Yes, right now. Quite well, not very fast, not very slow. I think it's a decent performance. Alright, so this is the drawing speed. I close the program. I will show you just how you can feel. Yes, you notice the ghosting even when typing, but I had to show you this. Overall, the performance is quite fine in Windows, nothing to brag about. Alright, let's turn off the system. Actually, not turn off the system, exit Windows, and then I will run the Windows 95 benchmarks. Alright, let's run Windows 95. The performance should not be bad. As mentioned, the video chipset is fast enough for such a system. The graphics settings are 640 by 480 in 256 colors, so it's not overly demanding. Alright, let me see. I will show you something interesting in this benchmark. If you notice that the screen is brighter, yet it gets darker on the other side. As far as I can tell, this is not necessarily an issue with the fluorescent lamp. I think it's mostly caused by the fact that the way in which the screen is being updated. I think it's not a dual scan screen, it's a single scan one. Means that I don't know exactly if this is the reason, but anyway, the parts on the lower and on the left side and on the right side are actually being driven from just one side. I'm not entirely sure if this is the case or not, but I have seen this effect in many passive matrix screens. No, it is a slight difference, but mostly no. No, it's just sorry. It's just due to the fact that if the image that is closer to that area has a darker color, it's going to maintain this dark color further. Alright, so it's a smearing, if you like. Alright, let me show you the performance. 23 megabytes per second. This value is not bad, and I will show you immediately why. If you are going to compare it with other 486s of the era, you're going to notice that the performance is quite good, especially when you think about the access to RAM, because over here the cache is already exhausted. So this is the memory access. So the chipset is quite good. I have to say that this is a major achievement, and in here you consider it compared with a 15 MHz system. So the 75 MHz one has the same good performance, or has a higher one but the same tendency. I think that this value is very good. It goes on to show that in this case, in this particular case, probably the 75 MHz speed is entirely reliable. meaning that what your expectations are for such a processor are going to be entirely met. Alright, calculations, yes, I'm just going to show you the value, and before, let me show you 40 megabytes per second for the MOV SD test is quite a good value. Again, we don't have a performance point for a 75 MHz processor, but I'm not expecting it to be that bad. I'm expecting it to be in line or slightly faster. It's going to take some time until the test is going to be finished. I don't know, around 30 seconds or even more. This is the typical test that is going to be run in, I think, less than 10 seconds on a modern, or at least slightly modern Pentium 3 or Pentium M processor, to be more precisely. So, yes, I think that we have come a long way from the performance we had with these processors and all the things that, all the necessary simplifications we had to use in games and applications in order to achieve the performance that was decent on such low-powered machines. 55 seconds or even longer. I just came with that value out of I think a Pentium 1 system, which is reasonable because a Pentium 1 at 143 can clearly get around 30 seconds. Alright, so this is the performance you can expect. I don't think you can have high expectations for certain games. I will show you some those games because I think we overstepped them, but anyway. And something around Wolfenstein 3D, Doom, because I show you the benchmark, but I think it would be good to see how the system reacts with typical games. Alright, so let's run Doom. Like I said, Doom on a 486 is not going to have any issues. I think it can run even with standard speed 486. Let's see, can I make it much brighter? I think this one is a good compromise. New game, yeah. Even if the screen updates are not very fast, I think that the frame rate is good. As I said, I'm not expecting any problems because Doom was a game that was designed for a 486 system. And especially with the X4 at 75 MHz, it's plenty enough power, plenty enough processing power. I think that around a 66 MHz processor is going to be plenty for Doom. As you can see, no slowdowns. I have to make a short mention over here. If you remember how I showed you Doom on the Western Digital, Siemens Nixdorf PCD4ND, you may have noticed some slight slowdowns. I'm pretty sure that on the monochrome system it wasn't quite obvious if there were slowdowns or not when enemies were shooting at you and you were trying to do the same thing. So this still remains to be investigated. However, overall, I think that the system runs quite well. Of course, it's not overly demanding. As I said, the processor is the most important factor in performance. Alright, let me show you another typical old game that you can run very well. Lotus, yeah, it's a good game. Yes, I need to exit Autumn Commander in order to show you Lotus because there is not enough conventional memory. Chill of the Jungle runs quite nice. Yeah. You can play such a platformer on a typical passive magic screen. Is not going to look great, but I think that if you make some compromises, it's going to be acceptable. Especially if it's not a high pace or fast. Yeah. Alright, Wolfenstein 3D. Plenty of power. I think you can run it even on a 286. So it shouldn't be any issue. And as said, with a compact flash drive, it's overly fast. You notice again quite clearly the artifacts, the ghosting that occurs when objects are moving. You cannot do much about it. As I said, only an external screen will show you a perfect image, but of course it's going to have other issues due to scaling, but for such game, scaling is much less important than good time response and good contrast. So yeah, no issues here. Alright, let's end the game, and I think you got quite a good grasp of what the system is capable of. I will just go and run, I will just go and run Lotus. It's the last game I would like to show. We are not going to play High Octane or any other demanding game because I think it's overly bad. I can probably show you Heroes again because it's a passive metric screen and is not going to have any major issue. In this particular case, we are running the same race we did on the monochrome Siemens Nixdorf PCD4ND. As you can see, the color screen is much more enjoyable, although it doesn't have the response time in order to make this game to be entirely fun. I think that it goes on to show very easily why even a color passive metric screen was still a major improvement compared to monochrome ones that were previously available. So offering a cheaper laptop with a passive metric screen was not that bad, especially when you have to think that your typical laptop would cost around $2,000. So in this case, anything that could make it slightly more affordable would be a major advantage, even if of course it came with some shortcomings. Alright, and now let me show you a game that is entirely playable. I don't know exactly if the configuration is for a sound card, probably it is. Yes, let's change it so that it's not. You can run in even Heroes too, that's not a problem. Okay, sound card. No sound card. Save changes. I think you can run this game even on an 8 MB system. Yes, as you can see, it's entirely playable. It looks very nice. The screen is entirely filled. I don't know, started like that. Of course, it's not going to be overly fast, but it's playable. Since it's a turn-based game, you're not going to have major issues when these movements will take place. I still think that it's entirely enjoyable in this state. Of course, it's not going to be overly pleasant, but it's one of the good games to play. Probably SimCity, again, is another very good choice. Alright, so I think I have shown you everything I had in mind. As mentioned, there is no sound card. However, this laptop has the necessary placements for a microphone and a speaker. So clearly there was another configuration that had an integrated sound card. This one doesn't have it. Overall, if the laptop is good, I think that the most important advantage of this laptop, besides the easy access to the hard drive, is the good keyboard, the good configuration, because it's a Chips&Tech video chipset that has predictable performance. And the compact size, because it's quite a compact laptop. What I don't like it at all, but this is not an issue with this particular laptop, the screen technology is just very unpleasant. Of course, it's a step up from monochrome screens, but still it's very bad compared with a TFT screen. And of course, the never-ending problem of the floppy disk drive that is mostly unusable at this point. Even if you find a bad drive, it's difficult to repair, and then it's going to break apart. It's going to break at a certain time in the future. So I don't think that you can have too much fun with the floppy disk drive. However, the Pcmcia slots are a major advantage. You can probably place most adapters that can fit, because that can be working with Windows 95. You can probably even run Windows 98, but I strongly recommend against it, especially if you don't have a very fast processor, and this clearly is an issue. It's a 486, it's not a Pentium 1, and even with Pentium 1, the first generation Pentium 1 is not fast enough, in my opinion, to run Windows 98. And also the memory capacity, unless it's more than 16 megabytes, I think it's just a bad choice. Alright, so I think that this sums up the review. Overall, it's a good laptop, but especially I would recommend it if you find the CT version. The CT version should have the TFT screen. The CS has the passive, the color passive magic screen, which is not that great. But if you want it just and you have an external monitor you can use, then it's entirely pleasant. You can plug in an external PS2 mouse and you are just on your way to having a blast with 486 era games. Of course, no sound card, but as mentioned, this is not particularly bad. I think that the screen is the most important letdown in this configuration, and as mentioned, it fully supports ATX commands. Alright, so this was the review. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe to the channel, and I have many interesting models I will like to show you and different videos. So have a very pleasant day.